Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Composition. Composition is the arrangement and organization of visual elements. So essentially, if you have a canvas, it's the way that you put everything onto it. How do you arrange the overall look of the artwork to get certain effects and to create an effective illustration? A good composition conveys the message/intentions of the work of art, and it guides the viewer through the experience. So you always want to be thinking about how can you make the viewer look where you want to look? How can I make one element lead them to the next? You do so through composition techniques. Maybe you've heard of rule of thirds and the golden ratio. These might be two of the most well-known and famous composition techniques. Despite being called rule of thirds, it's not a rule that you always have to follow. You don't always have to put the most important elements in these areas, but you can get an interesting look if you do so. It's kind of just like a foolproof guideline for you to follow. Here are some more common composition techniques. There's overlap. It leads the eye and creates visual hierarchy. So I've given two examples, one with basic shapes and one with just some subject matter. In this case, a flower. So over here you can see that the edges of the shapes are perfectly aligned. And why you want to avoid this generally is because you can't really tell what's in front of the other. This doesn't show any depth. You just know that they're kind of touching, but it's confusing to look at. And it creates these points of interest that may not be where you actually want the viewer to look. So these tangents and these sharp angles. And because you know that this part overlaps, is just a lot of the line attracts a lot of attention here, along with every other point that they overlap. So in this subject matter demonstration, it's the same. Over here you can't tell is the flower or the bud in front. Whereas if we go over to this side, here you can clearly see that these objects are behind. So this one is behind this one, which is behind this one. These are potentially on the same level since they're both behind B, and then behind A are two more objects. So you can tell that C is clearly in front of everything else. And it kind of brings you in because the objects behind will bring you forward. And it kind of has a flow as opposed to here, where it's a little more confusing where to look because everything is kind of pulling you to look at it. You can look here, you can look here, or you can look here. Whereas this one, it just feels a little more satisfying and it feels like you're being guided through the composition. So you can tell here the flowers are a bit easier to understand now that they've got the overlap. This big flower is definitely in front of everything else. The composition is a lot easier to read in that aspect. Next example is scale and proportion. Scale and proportion create emphasis and dramatic impact. You can see here, these are all the same scale. And I've put two characters right next to each other. And you can see the change in the atmosphere when I place one further away. It feels like there's more emotion in this scene compared to this one. Here they are just standing next to each other and they have the same expressions, but you can really feel the depth and the space between the characters just by making one smaller and one bigger. In the example with the squares, I've now created a focus point by having the main square so much bigger than the other. And in this case, it's not wrong. So none of these really, they're not rules, just guidelines, just things that generally can do certain things with composition. But if there's a reason for you to place things like this, or a reason to place them like this, then that is fine as well. But it's just important to note that whether you make these decisions actively or not, they will impact the way the viewer consumes your illustration. So the last one is cropping. It creates a sense of intimacy and brings focus to whatever you decide to crop. For example, here, the shapes are all within the confines of the canvas, just floating there, as if you're observing this group of shapes. But once it's been cropped, it's as if you're among the shapes. You feel closer to them. Or maybe this seems a little bit abstract, so I've also provided an example with a person. Here, the character is sitting within the confines of the canvas, and it's as if you're viewing them from a little distance away. But if we decide to crop it so that you can see the character's details better, and you don't see all of the character, it feels like you're right next to them and you're in their presence. So that just shows the different kind of feeling that you can create with something as basic as cropping, scale, and overlapping. And these are not the only compositional techniques or methods that you can use. There are quite a few. These are just some important ones that I tend to use a lot, and just some examples. For this next part, I am going to go over some of my artwork, including the illustration, the final illustration for this class. I'm going to talk about my thought process, what went into coming up with these compositions, and just breaking down the composition in hindsight now that it's complete. So for this illustration, when I was working on it, I wanted to compose the character first because I wanted this to be a character-focused illustration. So I just drew whatever pose that I thought would bring out the character design and bring focus to the areas I wanted focus on. For example, her thigh ribbon and her face and front of her costume. I wanted these to be visible, which is why the arm is here. The arm I decided to place here so that it leads up into the face and it's kept out of the way of her body with the design that I wanted to show. The tail cloth thing, the hip waistband, it leads the eye from the background into the character. I could have drawn it more droopy, but I wanted that smooth incline up because it felt more satisfying that way. And just to clarify, posing the character is also part of composition. You're deciding where to put what shapes, and it will have a big effect on the final result. So for example, this character, if I were to break down the composition, I'd say the thigh leads you up, the cloth material leads you up as well. Everything is kind of working to lead you into the face. As for the background, the waterfall I thought of because I was looking through my reference images and I liked the idea of drawing some waterfall coming down this way and bringing attention to the character flowing down her body and having the rocks framing the scene. So the rocks bring the character out from this plain blue background, but don't detract from the character because it's surrounding her. So it kind of pulls you evenly outward that it doesn't attract too much attention, if that makes sense. For example, if I didn't have these rocks here and I only had the rocks here, then it would feel unbalanced and you would only want to look on this side because there's nothing here. It'll just be this background color. But since there are rocks here, it feels more enclosed. Naturally, if you surround something with a frame, you will bring focus to it. I didn't want the frame to be too heavy either, so thematically, I also thought that these flowers would help the composition. This tree coming out from the rocks and hanging over towards the characters. So you can see that the direction of the branches also bring you in from the edges of the artwork into the character. And they also work to break up these large shape of rocks. Because if I have this large patch of green and nothing to really break it up, it will take up a lot of attention. But because these flowers are here instead on top of it, it balances that pull. It balances it, and because it's leading you into the character, it again adds focus to her instead of the background. Actually, to break up the rocks even more, at some point I added in these extra waterfalls on this side, along with these birds and the petals, because I thought that the green of the rocks was a little bit overwhelming if I didn't have these. It's just a lot of rock. A lot of space just taken up by rock. These sorts of elements are also really great if you do want to hide any strange tangents or close touches just awkward, randomly occurring rock patterns, and you just want to break it up, you can just add a bird right in the middle, and it'll look a little less awkward. Or you can put some petals. You can think about how to insert these elements to make the composition better and more pleasing to look at. So moving on to this next artwork, Reminiscence of a Summer, I utilized something, a Z-shaped composition. You'll notice this in landscapes quite often because it kind of brings you to different elements around a landscape. Although my artwork isn't a landscape, it is a landscape dimension. So I've placed points of interest around the artwork, which lead you through this Z shape and through the focal point, which is the character. I do this through both use of subject matter that are detailed. So I place some detail here, and I use some bright colors that don't show up as much throughout the rest of the artwork, along with larger patches of bright colors here and here. So I don't plan this out really, but the reason this Z shape forms kind of naturally, whether I plan it out or not, is because when you're placing elements down on your canvas, you'll tend to want to place them of varying sizes and at varying heights and lengths. Let me just box them out a little bit. Because on the other hand, compare this to if instead I decided to just place all these points of interest just straight across the middle like this. Same size, same height. They all appear in a row. That would look quite unnatural, right? And you would just maybe stare across the image like this. It doesn't feel as the flow isn't there. The flow that brings you around the entire canvas is gone. If I am to illustrate this just a little better, if I cover these up and I just place a bunch of red flowers here, and here. You'll notice the effect. It looks graphical, and it really pulls you to these points instead of around the entire canvas, which is what I would prefer. Lastly, for this artwork, this is also not something that I thought about when I drew this picture, and is also a kind of a reason why these two character designs work well together is because Chai over here has very, well, me, but in winter form, has very round tails, round shapes, so many circles. Whereas Io here on the left has very sharp shapes, even including her arm that's coming down. It creates a lot of sharp pieces along with her horns and wings that are stretching out. This creates a really interesting visual contrast between the two characters, and it really makes Io stand out that much more in front of Chai's big tails. This piece also utilizes that kind of same placement of visual elements where I spread them out. I spread them out kind of evenly, ensuring that, for example, this doesn't line up with this. Because if it did line up, it just creates that much more of a, how would I explain it? The human brain is very good at recognizing patterns, even patterns out of the things that you don't draw. So even though you don't draw a line from here to here, you can still notice it just because this line is here and this line is here. It's kind of like those illusions where you'll have 3 circles cut out like this, and even though I haven't drawn a square, you'll notice that there's a square here. So you want to pay attention to the things you don't draw, the negative space, just as much as what you do draw. Yeah, so as you can see, I placed 2 items here, a few items here, just to fill out the background and not draw too much attention to the detail back there that's behind the characters, as well as complementing the characters thematically with a dragon here and a fox here. I also planned the pose so that you'll see the strongest lines draw you in to the characters' faces. Even the tails are going in. The hair subtly kind of leads you to the face. The wings as well take you from these corners of the illustration into Io. Okay, hopefully that helped explain a few more composition concepts. So there's one more artist that I want to introduce you guys to, called Alphonse Mucha. If my demonstration before with my own illustrations was a bit confusing, like what are all these lines and what are all these squares and shapes and things going on? Well, the reason I've chosen Mucha is because he makes incredibly effective compositions with mostly just very basic, simple shapes. If we go ahead and break down the one on the left, you'll see that it's really just made up of 3 circles, a line going around them, and a triangle for the character. You can break this down further if you want, but this is really just essentially it. And the one on the right, we have a big circle, a curved line leading up to the character, straighter line for the back of the legs, curved line for the front of the body, and then you have these extra bits, which you can either simplify to just an arc going across. I think this is probably the stronger simplification than trying to draw some more Doritos. Yeah. Very effective but straightforward compositions. And if all it takes is just a few lines and some shapes, then you have no excuse. Just kidding. But we'll be seeing this guy again for the coming exercise demonstration. I do highly recommend you check out his works. I'll write down his name over here. Alphonse Mucha. Here is the level 1 exercise for composition. So as you can see, I've brought up 4 more artworks from Alphonse Mucha, and the reason that I've chosen him again is because he just utilizes basic shapes so well in his compositions, and these shapes are just really great to work with no matter what level of art you are currently at. So for this exercise, I've already broken down the compositions into basic shapes. And your task is to grab these shapes. Your task is to grab these elements, these shapes. You can use Control Shift click and then Control C and Control V into the example box and Control T to manipulate it into the canvas over here. And you can start placing them down however you would like. Play around with the shapes and see how you can place them to create different effects. What looks nice and what doesn't. It would be best if you can imagine that you're composing a character with a background, just like these 4 examples. Because that way, you're getting in practice for our final illustration. So I've already done an example. Here is my composition using the shapes from these 4 examples. And the skills practice here are we're going to learn how to transform and manipulate the shapes. If you hold around the shape, you can rotate it. You hold within it, you move it around. If you control click any of the dots, you can warp the square. But yeah, have a play around. The second skill that is practiced is organizing visual elements. This is really important because it's to do with how the viewer is going to interpret and explore your illustration, where their gaze is going to fall and where it's going to go. It's about learning how to create visual harmony on our canvas in the space that we are given. Because even if you know how to detail, you also want to figure out where to detail, where to put everything so that the overall result is aesthetically pleasing. Don't mind me, I just did some rearranging so that I could fit in the tasks for level 2 and 3 over here. What I'd like you to do for level 2 is analyze the composition of an artist's work that you like. So find an illustration that you enjoy and try to break down the main compositional elements by simplifying everything like I've shown you already. And finally, for level 3, I'd like you to sketch a character and background elements onto your composition lines from level 1 and 2. So I'm going to sketch a little character on here just to demonstrate what I mean. I'm just going to make it up. Don't really know what I'm thinking right now. Basically, what I'm doing is looking at these lines and kind of imagining, can I see some kind of pose hidden in these lines, hidden in these shapes, and trying to just fit it in. Getting a little difficult to see what's going on, so I'm going to turn the opacity down. While I'm doing this, I'm kind of just thinking about what parts of the character can I fit into these elements that I have placed down already. Which, in the case of the character for the upcoming final illustration, is a bunch of these flowy fabric coming from her arms and waist. Feel free if you do see the opportunity to, what is it called? Change or deviate from the original composition. If you see some opportunity where you think adding something or removing something will look a lot better, go for it. But try to keep the overall composition still recognizable to the one that we have started with. I'm not really sure what to put in the background. Maybe I'll put in some random curtain looking things like Mucha draws or a tree. I kind of like how the bottom is more clean looking. So yeah, something like this. Alright, I hope you guys have fun with these and that you are able to learn something from them. I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye.